Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Cynthia Lawson Jaramillo. I'm the director of the Deed Research Lab and delighted to return after our summer hiatus with our series of monthly gatherings called La Hora. We started these last year as a way to continue to build dialogue and especially learning around all things related to critical craft, to the artisan sector, design, social impact, entrepreneurship, etc. And I was delighted when I reached out to our guests today and asked if they would consider participating in La Hora, and they enthusiastically said yes. So I'm delighted to hand it over to Nicole Messier and Victoria Manganiello. Nicole and Victoria will share some of their work and backgrounds, and then we will have time for conversation and Q&A. I'm happy to monitor the chat as we go along, so feel free to participate as questions arise, but we'll hold them until the end of the presentation. So Nicole and Victoria, I'll pass it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Cynthia. Thanks for having us, and nice to see you all. You may recognize Nicole and me because we're both part of the Parsons community, actually. Nicole's an alumni and an educator, and then I'm also an educator over in the School of Fashion. But today we're going to tell you about our work outside of the classroom. We co-run a creative studio that does art, design, craft, and all kinds of stuff. So I'm going to start by telling y'all about that, sort of a broad picture of where we're working and what we're working with. And then we're going to spend the bulk of this session telling you specifically about one project. So here is our website for Craftwork. Definitely check it out if you're curious. We decided to band together with the two of us, and then we have two other collaborators, because all of us agreed that, and we have seen out in the world, that there's so much more that comes from collaboration than from solo work. So we've all got similar interests, but different skills, and decided to sort of come together, pool our resources, and hopefully that means that we get to be involved in more stuff and touch various communities and audiences that way. In particular, we're interested in craft materials. We're interested in the history and the future of those materials. We're excited by novel and sustainable materials, and we also want to make sure that we're building experiences that tell stories and amplify the stories and the voices that may not otherwise be so. And in particular, craft is a medium that's often relegated to the back burner in both art and design spaces. So that's a brief description of our mission. We've got a variety of projects that you can come back and take a closer look at here. We will spend more time talking about the domestic machine, but we've done public art installations. We've played with generative content and AI. We've created books, experiences, installations, art, design, all kinds of stuff. So definitely come check that out if you're curious to learn more about us. So I think we could jump into the domestic machine, which is the primary project we want to share with y'all today.
Okay, great. Hi, I'm Nicole. So we're going to talk about the domestic machine, which is a feature-length documentary that we're working on. It's about machine knitting and the online craft communities that have formed around it. So for those of you that don't know what a domestic machine is, they made them starting in the 60s in a similar manner to a sewing machine. It was meant to be used at home. It never took off quite as well as the manufacturers would have liked, and they actually stopped manufacturing them in the early 2000s. But there's this cult following that uses the machines, both young and older generations. And if you go to look online on how to use them, you will see all these YouTube videos, primarily uploaded by the baby boomer generation on YouTube. And then during the pandemic, we've also seen a cult following kind of reform around this craft, particularly amongst millennial and Gen Zers. So we're telling this generational story about how people are relearning to use the tool through YouTube and So Victoria and I are both executive producers on the project, and we're also co-directing the project, and we're long collaborators. And we're also working with a film collective called Indigo Collective to help us do the production of the film.
So this is our first feature-length film, but we've been interested in film as a storytelling space and can imagine that we will continue to, which we'll talk a little bit more at the end of our talk. A log line here is just sort of a synopsis. You can see some images of some of our subjects that are going to be included and that we've already been meeting and filming throughout the project.
So we're really looking at how YouTube is a place of archiving, and not traditional archive, but a place where craft is being passed down through generations, how craft has always been, but now through technology and across different geographical locations.
I think we've all had that experience where we needed a piece of information or an instruction of some kind, and then we went online and found not just an answer, but an answer delivered from a super well-informed, quirky, clear, nice human. And I think that that's something we really want to capture in this, because why is it that these people have made these videos? In most cases, they're not being paid. There's no promise for some kind of fame, but they still go ahead and share their knowledge for free online.
Yeah, and we love the range of the different production values. Like some people are using high-end cameras, some people are using iPhones. And so it's really an accessible platform for people to upload their information and share it with others.
So as we think about this film, or as we've been thinking about it in preparation, and now that we're sort of right in the middle of our filming, we've got, maybe you could think about it as three main characters or three main character types. We have 6 subjects, which we'll talk about in a moment, and they each fall into either the younger generation or the older generation of knitters. And then our third kind of category type is the machine itself. And as we've been filming, we've really been thinking about the machine as a character and getting these really close up and interesting shots of the machine in operation. Any Parsons students on the call today may have taken a class in machine knitting, because we do offer it at Parsons. So it might feel more familiar to this community, but I do think it's important to mention that in the larger world of, let's say, YouTube or the world of craft, the knitting machine is pretty niche and pretty hard to find.
So this summer we started production, and we've done 3 shoots so far. And our first travel shoot, we went to Rhode Island and Connecticut to film our first 2 subjects. The first one, her name is Lindsay Deegan. She is a knitwear designer, but also a community organizer. She's been using a knitting machine for a good 15 years. And she started off her brand by showing at New York Fashion Week. And she did that for about 8 years. But once Instagram came online, she really realized that who her audience was, and her audience were other people who were knitting and crafting. And so she's kind of retailored her brand Deegan to her audience, that are these people on the internet who actually knit, as opposed to New York Fashion Week. But in addition to her brand, she also started an online knitting platform called Knit Club. And it's an online queer BIPOC space, and all are welcomed to both like gather and share their projects, but also to learn and take classes together. And although the platform is online, a lot of these folks have started to meet up in person, and there's in real life knit clubs around the United States.
Susan is another one of our subjects who we also visited. Here's a still from our interview with her that you'll see eventually in the film. Susan has a similar but also very different story from Lindsay. Susan was around for the beginning of these knitting machines and actually worked selling them door to door. Eventually went on to write various books and create various videos, many of which myself and Nicole included, but so many other machine knitters have relied on heavily in learning and practicing with this tool. And Susan, we were so excited to meet her because we've watched her video so much, but when we went to her home and we were filming, it was especially charming to see how dynamic a person she is. She's come to us to feel like kind of solely a knitter, but of course she is dynamic and she has other relationships and other hobbies and other interests. And we hope with the film that we can show how dynamic all of these characters are.
She's really interesting as well from the business perspective in machine knitting because she sold those, so she really understands like the arc of the machine, the knitting machine, and how it came to rise and then didn't do so well and was stopped manufactured. Annie is another one of our characters. She's also Parsons faculty. She owns a knitwear brand called All Knitwear, and she's been teaching machine knitting at Parsons for years. And for us, we're looking at the academic lens through Annie with machine knitting.
Diana Sullivan is another one of our subjects. We haven't been yet to film her, but we're in the process of planning for that shoot. She lives down in Texas. She's another one of these people that has created a lot of videos that many of us have relied upon. She's sort of notorious for never showing her face. And so I think, the niche aficionados in this community will be very excited, or at least I expect they will, to see Diana, not just her face, but in her home. And we're all so familiar with her hands, but it'll be really great to see her out in again, being that dynamic person that she is. She lives in Texas, and I think we're also excited to be able to show multiple different corners of this country. It's worth noting that machine knitting is not just an American thing, although that's where we've decided to focus because we're thinking about the YouTube and the digital experience here. Coincidentally, or not coincidentally, but surprisingly, machine knitting developed a different sort of, let's say, interest or fame in other countries. And so I think that we're also kind of curious about why it didn't take off as successfully in the US as it did in other countries.
Diana also is an educator, but she really did machine knitting as a hobby, and she had a career as an accountant. And so a year and a half ago, Victoria and I started interviewing folks who are in the machine knitting community, and we found a lot of the baby boomer generation. All the women had very technical careers. Some of them were IBM programmers, some of them accountants, but they all had this like deep fondness of machine knitting. So also part of the story that we're trying to tell is that, craft is a technical subject as well.
Jacques is another one of our younger generation knitters who actually graduated from Parsons just a handful of years ago. And they have been quickly and swiftly developing a successful fashion brand. Previously known as Black Boy Knits, now known by their last name Agbobley. So definitely check out their work. We're really excited to, again, include these people from different generations and illustrate their connections. So Jacques was enrolled in Annie's class at Parsons, relying on Diana and Susan's videos for homework help. I think it'll be an interesting part of our story too, to illustrate these connections, because it may not have been likely that these people would have met each other otherwise if it wasn't for New York just having such different experiences in life, living in different parts of the country, being different ages. There's something really lovely that their shared affection for machine knitting brings them together and creates this community.
And Charlene Schaefer is our last subject. We're actually going to film her at the end of September in Peru, Indiana. She runs a business called the Knick-Knack Shop, and she sells knitting machines, she refurbishes them, she sells yarn, and she really sells them to people all across the United States. Places like Parsons and FIT all go to her to buy their materials. Her story is a kind of a fairy tale story. She learned machine knitting through her mom. Her mom was stationed in Japan and brought home a knitting machine, and then she started a knitting machine circle with people in her town. And then there was actually a knitting store that was going for sale that was on a farm. So in the 70s, she bought that store and part of the farm, and she decided that she would run this business. And she's been running the business since the 70s. And over the years, slowly her family has started to get involved. So at first, her husband stopped farming and helped her run the knitting machine shop. And then her son also helps her run it now. And her two daughters are also teaching knitting at FITM in Los Angeles.
So those are our 6 subjects, and here is our team. So you've already met Nicole and myself, and then Nick, Ricky, Tatiana, and Josh are behind the camera and really helping us collectively. The 6 of us are working together to produce this project. The 4 of them have their own collective called Indigo Collective, and they've worked together in other projects. So we also think of this as kind of like a Craftwork and Indigo Collective collaboration. And it's been just really fun working together as a team and learning more about the film industry. I think here's a couple more photos of us on the road filming, and we've got some more on the next slide.
Yeah, so far we've done one shoot in a studio with the machine where we really captured all angles of the machine as a character. And then we were on the road filming Lindsay and Susan. And we also got to capture some footage of the knitting labs at RISD in Providence, Rhode Island. These are some pictures of Lindsay Deegan and in her studio in Rhode Island and outside of her studio. Some more of Susan. This is in Susan's house. And then this is, she loves her garden and works on it every day. And so we filmed a lot of her garden. And she kind of treats her garden as an art project, and you'll see like woven fences and big sculptures in her garden.
And here are some film stills. So we're still working on editing and playing with the footage that we've collected and really telling the story in the order that we want to, and haven't totally finalized that yet, of course, as we continue to film. But anyway, I think these stills give you a sense of the aesthetic. And these are 4 images of Lindsay, a few more of Lindsay in her home with the colors that she lives with. Same thing for Susan and her space. And our visit to RISD again. So this project, like Nicole mentioned, is going to be a feature film, and we're super excited about that. We can't wait to share it with everyone. We hope that it'll be ready in about a year's time for film festivals and all that kind of thing. But we also have plans to continue telling stories that demonstrate the connections between textiles and other spaces. So if the domestic machine is making a connection between the internet and textiles by focusing on the ways that people have shared textile knowledge online and created community around it, we intend with our larger project that we call Woman Interwoven to continue making connections like that. So for example, in our research for Woman Interwoven, we've been speaking with a biologist based in France who's knitting organs, because in fact, our bodies are a little bit more receptive to organ transplants that are created in a flexible structure like knitting, as opposed to something that's a little more like a Lego structure that we've been doing in organ transplant thus far. So those are just 2 examples, but we're going to explore how textiles connect to all kinds of industries with this larger project. So we want to show you a quick video now that tells you more about sort of our larger vision, including the domestic machine, but all of the other film concepts that we want to explore.
When we think of textiles, we usually think of clothing or fabrics, but really it's so much more than that.
I'd like to introduce our MIT biosuit. It literally is a second skin design. That circle will turn elliptical as she moves.
We are currently developing antibacterial medical implants with silk and textile techniques.
Future Flora is a kit designed for women where the woman can make her own sanitary pad with bacteria and wear it in the underwear to treat and prevent candida infection.
These are the materials that power, adorn, and signify our human life. Women's textile skills have been behind some of the world's biggest innovations, but we've mostly been left out of the stories that define those industries.
We are missing half of the story. As many of us, I use textiles every day and I don't really realize it. I like to be inspired by ancient things to create new ones.
These stories have really been undocumented until now.
We'd never get to the moon if we always did it the same old way.
So that is a lot of information about a large project, but we figured we'd sort of conclude here and we can open it up for dialogue. We did want to make sure we get to share our social channels, and if you guys are curious to follow along as we continue to film all of these projects, you can find us at Craftwork_collective on Instagram, and our website is craftwork.today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
that
you.
was really, wow, what a beautiful and inspiring set of images and stories, and as you call them, subjects or characters. And yeah, so the floor is open for any questions or comments. You can, if you put it in the chat, I'm happy to read it out loud, but if you want to type in the chat that you have a question, I can call on you, or if you want to raise your Zoom hand, that also works. I'm happy to kick things off. Nicole and Victoria, it was really, so when I first learned about the domestic machine is when you were doing a crowdfunding campaign, and I was, the learning of the Deed Research Lab has been primarily in the context of indigenous and traditional artisans in Guatemala, in Colombia, and India. We're also we've been in touch with the community of quilt makers in Gee's Bend, Alabama for a couple of years now with my colleague Ibarra Wadud. But I was really struck that the motivation and how you are telling the story in the domestic machine had so many, to me, it had so many connections and parallels with the reasons why, for example, designers will tell me that they want to start a collection with a group of traditional artisans. So it's about cultural heritage, it's about skills that are being lost, and it tends to be in contexts of great poverty and marginalization that may not necessarily be the case in what you're exploring or in the craft communities on YouTube. And so I wanted to bring you here for us to also engage in a conversation of what might we learn from the domestic machine and the communities around machine knitting that perhaps could translate into interesting models within the artisan sector. And yeah, I don't know if you have any comments about that. I guess my direct question would be, has there been a motivation within the knitting community that is about saving a craft that is being lost, or do people not necessarily see themselves on that kind of mission and they're just engaging with machine knitting for the love of making or the love of textiles? That was a lot.
Yeah. Well, I will say one comment. It's interesting to talk about this as like something that's passed down from generation to generation. And I think something that motivates Victoria and myself is that we are slowly seeing part of the machine knitting community of the older generation disappear. And so that's why we're like documenting it now. So we can document their stories, document the history, and make sure that it's archived somewhere where there's a story behind that YouTube video that was uploaded by Diana.
Yeah, machine knitting is not as a whole new, but the domestic version is relatively new from the 60s and 70s, whereas knitting itself beyond the machine is many thousands and tens of thousands of years old. So it's one brief moment in this larger craft story. The machines have always been generally inaccessible. They're expensive. They've always been expensive. And so they've kind of always been a niche part, despite the fact that it's continuing to become more niche. I think one thing that can feel a little more universal, though, is this online sharing aspect. And there's just something really wonderful about a free resource like YouTube. We could talk about Google and all of this other thing, the other things that connect to that in another way, but we find it really exciting that anyone with a library card, let's say, or an internet connection can go on and find this content when so much of this exclusive content is usually behind the doors of an institution or a library you have to pay for, that kind of thing. So in examining something that's very niche and perhaps has its own limitations, we hope to also explore what it means for knowledge to be shared for free. And perhaps with time, this might come back and might become more accessible as a tool.
Yeah, and so maybe we'll talk a bit about the framing of the domestic. If you could share with us in what contexts are these or were these machines used, if not domestic? And I'm particularly interested in this notion of the domestic because in the artisan sector, the fact that artisans can work from home on their craft is used as a very positive thing. And it's used in a lot of the marketing, claiming sustainability and claiming flexibility, and this kind of framing that is very capitalist, and that in our research we've connected to, for example, the gig economy, which is not as great as the business model designers want us to think of the platforms that they have designed. But for some artisans, sure, it's wonderful to have that flexibility and be able to continue their art making. For others who are depending on these wages to make a living and to feed their kids, they fall into exploitative models that one of the things we call for in our lab is for greater accountability across designers and entrepreneurs who are perpetuating these models. But yeah, curious to hear more about this, the framing of the domestic. If not at home, where are the machines used? And currently, are they being used in places that are not the home?
There are industrial versions, and our Parsons audience could go over to the Making Center on the second floor and see a couple of industrial versions of these machines. The domestic ones are being used across the world for production. In particular, I think in South America, there are makers that are working with designers that maybe come from Europe or North America that use those machines. I would love to see more people have access to these machines. And, we've in interviewing and learning more about the history, we've discovered that part of why the company stopped producing them is they made them too good, if you know what I mean. They last forever. They're durable, they're heavy, you can fix them. If we buy new appliances today, they're designed to break, whereas these machines are designed to last. And so they're expensive, but they're an investment. And I think it would be a really wonderful thing to share them with more artisans, because they may be interested in investing in that kind of tool or having access to it, so that it could maybe change that sort of home production. And we've called the films The Domestic Machine because these machines are referred to as domestic machines, but we're also thinking about what happens in the home and this interconnectedness from home to home across the world, and how that is in of itself a machine too.
And when they were selling these door to door, part of the story or the pitch to sell them relates to what you said, Cynthia, in that they were pitched as a way to make money. You could make a sweater at home and sell it. And there were also models that helped with this. So for example, you used to be able to fix sweaters for LL Bean with your knitting machine. They would sell you sweaters that had issues, you would fix them, and you would send them back to LL Bean. LL Bean would decide if they were of quality, and then they would ship them back to the customer. They also had a lot of people at home making hats. So you would get the pattern, you might make the hat, and then you would ship it back to LL Bean and they would ship it out. So that was also part of selling these machines door to door, is that you could make your money back in theory, but that never really came to fruition.
Wow, fascinating.
Yeah.
Thank you. Let me read Hannah's question in the chat and then we'll go to Jackie. So Hannah writes, hello, I'm curious about your reflections on the quality of crafts in the digital age. Do you think learning online has changed any elements of craftsmanship?
That's a big question. I thank you, Hannah, for asking it. I think it could go both ways. You know, we're really excited that people can learn stuff from home, that you don't have to leave the home maybe because you're taking care of another human, or you have a job that limits your access and your timetable to go to other spaces. So the idea that you could log on to YouTube and teach yourself to knit or crochet or sew in your own time, in your own space, is super exciting. And I think is expanding what craft can be by expanding the amount of people that can find the time for it. It's interesting that historically it was a necessity, and now in this age of fast fashion, it's a privilege to be able to craft. And so I think we're also interested in exploring how that has changed. It seems like maybe quality could also be a subjective thing, because if it's something that brings you joy and you can create something for yourself and your family, then that's its own quality, as opposed to maybe something that is going to be sold for a certain number.
Yeah, and even that framing of necessity, again, when we think about, for example, indigenous artisans, that they used to need to make craft because it's what it's the objects and the clothing that they wore and that they used, and now they're sometimes part of companies, right, where they're now producing to be able to then make a living, and that also sucks the joy out of the craft potentially if it now becomes a daily, I must do this, and if not, we can't eat. Jackie, I see your hand is raised.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant, fabulous production. Thank you so much. It's so interesting, all these intersections. I'm curious about, you know, if the baby boomer generation kind of got its start through the sales and the, you know, the kind of questionings that was going on about earning or making things for family, things like that. What is it that has inspired this younger generation to get started in it? Have you found that there's been I don't know, a catalyst somewhere that has done that? Like, how has it been reignited? Just wondering if you've got anything in there about that.
I think during the pandemic, when we were talking with Charlene, who sells the machines, just, you know, how there was extra time during the pandemic, the younger generation started to revisit this. And then many of the younger generation are using it for their fashion lines. So they are using it to make things that they could eventually sell.
It seems like this DIY, although the DIY thing is coming back into trend, which is sort of funny in the wake of it being a necessity for most of human history. But I do think that's part of it, that with these younger generations and the automation and the internet changing the way they live and move through the world, the ability to make something with your hands is desired. And I think as the generations go on, potentially, I'm just musing out loud here, but maybe we're moving in a direction where we are a little bit more precious about our materials. The younger generations are a little bit more in touch with where things come from, and we've been able to see over time footage and documentation of the unethical labor practices that are happening in a lot of fast fashion contexts. So perhaps there's a movement towards understanding the value of making something yourself and making something that lasts, so that it can be, you know, valued for what it should.
I think it's It's worth noting also, we haven't like converged on a particular like reason why it's coming back, but that there are a lot of different groups using the machine in different ways. So for example, there's a group of artists who have a project called All Yarns Are Beautiful, and they've created a motherboard where they can hack the machines and hook it up to their computer. And so we haven't found like one reason, but many reasons why people are using these machines.
That's really exciting. Thank you.
We'd
I
also
was,
love to hear from anyone who's
oh.
using them here. If any of you is using one, let us know. We're curious to see how people are playing with them. Sorry, Cynthia.
No, I'm sorry, I interrupted you. On my walk I'm on campus today, and on my walk to my office, I saw a poster in the Welcome Center here at the New School that asked the question, how might we slow down fast fashion? And yeah, the danger with that framing of that question is often resulting in greenwashing or social washing of corporate social responsibility offices within companies trying to do as much as they can towards sustainability. But it's really in this radical reshifting out. There is no slowing down of fast fashion. I think we have to center slow fashion. So what you're describing, that these trends and these shifts towards DIY, we have many students at Parsons exploring, the rise of thrifting and upcycling and hesitation to make clothes from scratch, which is really exciting and I think really connects with the spirit around sustainability that many of us celebrate now in craft, and perhaps that's seen as a privilege. So the privilege of sustainability is interesting. Shreya, thank you for your comment. Shreya wrote, knitting is a big livelihood and women's empowerment craft in Uttarakhand, India too, and NGOs are investing in machines as well. Thank you so much. I will also, I'll save that URL. We can drop it in the video recording. Thank you so much, Shreya, for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. Any other questions from others? I can keep going all day. I'll keep going, and others can again participate in the chat or raise your hand. Yeah, so I have in the Deed Lab we have thought, if sometimes people have asked, what would you do if you had a big donor or foundation say we want to endow the center? What would you want to do? And my dream would be that at design schools like Parsons, we're not only teaching the forward-looking digital age technologies, but that every student perhaps would graduate knowing at least one ancestral technology or ancestral craft. And one of the ways that we could do that is, in fact, to create video archives such as the ones that you commented on and that the documentary somewhat centers around. But the challenge that we have when we're thinking about indigenous crafts is the challenge of cultural appropriation. And so I'm wondering if in your work that has come up at all. Is there a claiming of authorship that in fact is not then shared across the community because it is seen as somebody's particular technique? Or is it that the machine knitting domestic community that you've identified has an openness or an open sourceness to it that would never create that? I don't want to call it gatekeeping because it sounds really negative, but that kind of maybe ownership of skills or knowledge that belong to a culture and that we may not necessarily want to share with everyone that is outside of that culture.
Yeah, it's such an important question, and I think we are, in focusing on how all of this exists online, we haven't spent as much time thinking about it outside of the computer, let's say, but it's something that's very much in front of our minds, and as we continue, we're trying to be very careful to to include that because it's an important part of the story. I think it's worth mentioning that the machine is a tool similar to the pair of needles. So what one can do on the machine, one can also do by hand. And so that's another way of saying that is anything that might be an indigenous practice, an indigenous knitting technique from a certain place could in theory be replicated on the machine. So I'm not sure that the machine itself has specific content because it's a tool. The people who use it might end up going in certain directions or might be certain people's. But the thing itself is a tool like a pencil or a crochet hook and is capable of doing whatever the person who's operating it can do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's really interesting framing. We tend to center artisans in our work, and if instead we were centering the machines, if we call any craft making set of tools a machine, then yeah, that could be a really interesting way around this question. I did a fieldwork research trip this summer to the Arctic region of Finland to learn about the indigenous Sami people, and I purchased a book that is a explanation with patterns and with dimensions of how to make, I think, four of the Sami designs. So there's kind of a shawl, there's the reindeer leather boots, there's a woven strip of textile that is used to wrap boots and wrap around the waist. But I found myself hesitating, is it okay that I have this book? If I were to hand this book off to students here, are they then going to be producing Sami designs that are appropriated? But so I really appreciate that framing around, if it's around the skills and the technologies, then maybe in some cultures they would definitely see it as cultural appropriation. But otherwise, when I asked a Sami person in Finland, what are the parts of their craft that I could, for example, purchase and wear, they were very clear in pointing out, for example, a piece of fabric that is woven is fine unless it has the traditional Sami colors and patterns. So it really gets to those design details when we think about a culture and appropriation. But yeah, I brought back this book, which I have here in my office, and have been wondering, is this a direction we should be taking at scale around the world? Many of us, Jackie, Farzana, others who are here who have come to prior La Horas, I know we've worked with artisans in various countries, and we know that in many contexts we're working with the last generation. And so I feel a sense of responsibility to document, and I also find that hesitation because of the concerns around appropriation.
Yeah, it's such an interesting and important conversation that I would love to continue. And I'm curious about that book for sure. And I hope that our students and our community continue to ask themselves these questions with everything they encounter. A lot of times we see a thing and it's been appropriated so many times over that it might be impossible to trace it back. So we do have to put in that work and always be aware of it.
Something we do at Craftwork, we make a lot of novel materials, novel textiles, and interactive textile installations. And so we always incorporate a thread of like historical storytelling. So just giving a nod to the past of how these have been textile traditions that have span across time and space.
Beautiful. Thank you. Farzana?
Yeah. Hi, thank you so much, Nicole and Victoria, for your wonderful presentation. I just have not a question, but just want to know your point of view around through these YouTube channels that we see in many cases, does it take away from the experience of, pure crafting as we know in the sense? And the additional question would be, at many a times we see these channels are used as marketing tools to generate business or generating, different models of business of engaging or creating your community of followers, or somehow commercializing the whole thing. So what is your point of view of YouTube as a knowledge sharing platform, or as a platform to generate business? What would be your thoughts?
It's an interesting question that we talk about often, is things around labor and how do we pay for labor. A good example of this is Lindsay, one of our subjects, has the Knit Club platform, and there are different tiers to joining Knit Club. There's a free version, but then there's also a paid version where you get access to classes. So on the one hand, it's nice when things are free, but also on the other hand, it's very important that craftspeople are paid for their labor. So it's like tricky to say, or hard to say, which one is better, free or paid, but there has to be like a balance. Yeah.
Yeah, there's been so much about crafts materials and the labor behind them that's been increasingly undervalued more and more as time goes on. I would say that my suspicion is that because so many of us are so far removed from the way things are made. Most of us don't make things at all, so we don't totally understand that a t-shirt that costs 99 cents at H&M must indicate that someone along the supply chain is not being treated fairly. We're just so removed from that. We're out of touch with the hands that make our objects that we rely on every day. So I hope that these kinds of, not just the YouTube video, but the films that we're working on, one outcome could potentially be reminding people about how things are made and reminding them of how much of these things that are handmade find their way back into all aspects of their lives. And maybe that'll make people a little more conscious. And for some folks, the free version of things is still going to be the right choice. And for other folks who might have that resource that they could spread around, will feel more comfortable paying for it. It's amazing how, we'll spend $7 for a matcha latte on the corner, but we won't spend 99 cents to watch someone teach us how to knit, as if that is less valuable. But our value system is kind of rejiggering, I hope, but currently in a weird state. So I think one of our missions is to really put labor in front of people with an optimistic tone. Like, how amazing are these people? How skilled are they? And how generous are they that they're going to share their content? And then we hope that this inspires people to be more thoughtful with their own consumption.
Yeah, thank you so much for your referencing this to, I'm from Bangladesh. I can totally relate to that $7 t-shirt that you're talking about. Yeah. I think, yes, that's where probably storytelling and all of these things behind the crafts that comes to play. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, it will be interesting when you interview I forget her name, the woman who's published 200 books.
Yes, Charlene Schaefer.
Her perspective, if she were to be starting her practice today, I don't know that she would go the route of 200 books. Would it be like a Patreon, right? A Patreon with subscribers, or what would be the other models? We've been very inspired in the lab by the work of Monica Moisin, who started something called the CIPRI, Cultural Intellectual Property Rights Initiative. And it's she, for example, suggests a royalty model for artisan knowledge, so that artisans, when a designer comes into their community and then is inspired by their work and then creates collections that doesn't necessarily benefit them, how could we, through a royalty model, pay for that knowledge and that the centuries of labor that preceded that moment of inspiration that we then see on the runway or on the H&M racks or elsewhere. Perhaps to end, I wanted to hear a bit more about the Woman Interwoven initiative and the direction that you're taking there. That example of I think the French person who is weaving threads for medical purposes. I also know that indigenous artisans in Peru have participated in similar medical technology, knitting or weaving. But what other examples do you expect to find, or do you already know that you want to include there? And also, how might our work in the lab maybe also serve as a point of connection for a perspective maybe from the global south, or maybe other perspectives that you may not yet have in the initiative?
Well, we would love to come into the lab and talk more about all of this, Cynthia. So you'll definitely be hearing from us to schedule that. Yeah, the Woman Interwoven project is on the horizon. So we're focusing on the domestic machine now, and then that's where we're headed next. We did a crowdfunding, as you mentioned, for the domestic machine, which was really fruitful, and our community has really helped us put it together. And so once we conclude with this project, we'll also seek out other opportunities to fund that. Again, speaking of labor, we're trying to make sure that we pay our film crew and anyone that we ask to work on these things equitably. But we are and have been for years, and in the meantime, continuing to do research. So to answer your question more specifically, we talked about the medical storyline. We've also connected with luthiers who are redesigning strings for violins and guitars using sort of ancient twisting and spinning methods. We've been looking at the sports industry and the ways that balls and bats and jerseys are made, space exploration and the space suit and how that has changed over time, the food industry and the way we make cheesecloth and other sorts of fibrous materials for seeds and other things to grow. Really feels like an endless list. And you know, we don't yet know the order in which we're going to be filming those. It might be based on the access we have or the potential collaborators that we encounter.
And we see the domestic machine and the Woman Interwoven as like all part of one practice of telling stories about textiles and craft.
Wonderful, thank you. I think we'll close off from with Shreya. You have a question or comment, Shreya?
Hi, yeah, sorry, I missed the beginning, but I wanted to point out this very beautiful project that a friend of mine runs called Root Studio, I think. And she's done something where she's taken indigenous and craft designs and digitized them so that they can be downloaded for a copyright fee. But through this project, she has kind of been dealing with a lot of some of the comments that people have been bringing up in this talk, like about labor, about wage employment, and her project seemingly gives them ownership of their designs, but also somewhat frees them up from the labor of having to stitch or create those designs. They kind of just come up with them, and then they are digitized online, and then like kind of like how on Etsy you can download designs for knitting and weaving. This is very specific to like specific communities where you can download motifs. I just wanted to point that project out because it seems pretty nice.
Thank you. We'll definitely check that out.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Shreya, so much for sharing that. I was able to find it, so I dropped the link in the chat. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you so much, Nicole and Victoria. Thank you all for joining us today. I hope you'll come to future Lauras. We usually meet on the first Monday of every month, and the best way to find out if there's a postponement on a particular month is on Instagram at Deed Lab, which is the Instagram handle for our lab. Our next Laura will be on Wednesday, October 4th, and yeah, hope to see you there or future occasions. Be in touch. And oh, I didn't say first Wednesday, Farzana? What did I say?
You said Monday.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry. Yes, first Wednesday of every month. Thank you so much, Farzana, for that. And thank you again, Nicole and Victoria, for kicking off our fall series. And thank you all so much for coming and your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Bye,
much.
everyone.
Bye.